He didn't hide in the mountains. He didn't disappear into the jungle. He lived among us, smiled in family photos, paid taxes, attended parent-teacher meetings, and at the same time, he was sending information to a hostile intelligence service. He betrayed his country, then another, then both, all of it without a single shot fired. This man lived 3 lives at once. He had 2 wives, 2 names, 2 passports, 1 child no one knew existed, and an entire system that created him, then declared him dead. But the most disturbing part doesn't start there. Because when the FBI finally came for him, it should have been over. Trial, life sentence, prison, but he didn't serve a single day. He did something that changed everything. In this video, you'll discover how perfect spies are made, what happens when they go off script, and why one man turned out to be more valuable than all his betrayals combined. But be warned, by the end, the story becomes so tangled and surreal that you may not believe it really happened. Watch closely. Because the truth, just like this man, wears a perfect disguise. In the early 1970s, a brilliant young chemistry student named Albrecht Dietrich was excelling at his studies in East Germany. Top of his class, sharp mind, fluent in multiple languages, everything about him suggested a promising academic career. But the Cold War had different plans for promising young minds. The approach came quietly, almost casually. A professor mentioned that certain government representatives might be interested in speaking with him. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise suspicions. Just a conversation about serving his country in a more meaningful way. What they offered him wasn't a job in the traditional sense. It was a complete transformation, a chance to become what they called a scout for peace. The terminology was deliberately vague, deliberately idealistic. It masked the true nature of what they were asking him to do. The Soviet intelligence apparatus didn't just recruit agents, they created them. They took ordinary people and rebuilt them from the ground up, turning them into weapons of information warfare. And Albrecht Dietrich, with his analytical mind and linguistic abilities, represented the perfect raw material. The Cold War wasn't just about nuclear weapons and political posturing. It was about something far more intimate. The ability to place your people inside the enemy's most trusted institutions, to have them live undetected for decades, gathering intelligence that could shape the course of history. But becoming a deep-cover agent meant something most people couldn't comprehend. It meant agreeing to disappear from your own life, to abandon your identity, and to live in a state of permanent deception. Why would someone make such a choice? What kind of person willingly signs up to become a ghost? Moscow in the mid-1970s was a city of secrets, and hidden within its bureaucratic maze was a facility that few people knew existed. This was where the Soviet intelligence services transformed ordinary citizens into perfect Americans. The training was unlike anything most people could imagine. Days began before dawn with exercises in surveillance detection. How to spot a tail, how to lose one, how to move through a city while remaining completely invisible. But the psychological conditioning was even more intense. Albrecht had to learn to think like an American, to absorb not just the language but the cultural reflexes, the unconscious gestures, the small details that separate a native from someone who simply studied the culture. He spent hours listening to American radio broadcasts, studying regional accents, learning to speak English with the subtle inflections of someone who grew up in the Midwest. He memorized baseball statistics, studied American history, and practiced the art of casual conversation until it became second nature. The most crucial element was the identity itself. Soviet intelligence had perfected a technique that sounds like something from a thriller novel, but was devastatingly real. They would search through American death records, looking for children who had passed away at a young age, before they would have had social security numbers or extensive documentation. Then they would construct an entire life around that dead child's identity. Birth certificates, school records, employment history. A complete paper trail that would pass even careful scrutiny. Jack Philip Barsky had been a real person once, a child who lived briefly in the 1940s before passing away, leaving behind nothing but a name and a birth certificate. Soviet intelligence took that name and built a life around it, creating a fictional history so detailed that even Jack himself began to believe it. But creating a false identity is one thing. Living it convincingly for decades is something entirely different. 1978. A man with a Canadian passport stepped off a flight in New York, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a carefully constructed life story. To anyone watching, he appeared to be just another immigrant seeking opportunities in America. But this wasn't immigration. This was invasion. The first months were harder than anyone had anticipated. The training in Moscow had been thorough, but nothing could fully prepare someone for the psychological weight of living a complete lie. Every conversation was a performance. Every relationship was built on deception. The man calling himself Jack Barsky found work as a bicycle messenger, navigating the streets of Manhattan while his handlers in Moscow waited for him to establish his cover. The job was perfect for someone who needed to remain mobile, to observe the city without drawing attention. But Jack had bigger ambitions. He enrolled at Baruch College, applying the same intellectual discipline that had made him successful in East Germany. He graduated at the top of his class, an achievement that opened doors throughout the American business world. Metropolitan Life Insurance Company offered him a position as a computer programmer. To his supervisors, he was simply a talented employee with an impressive work ethic. They had no idea that their new hire was methodically analyzing their systems, identifying weaknesses, and preparing to extract information that would be invaluable to Soviet intelligence. The irony was almost perfect. An American company, proud of its technological innovations, had unknowingly hired someone whose job was to steal those very innovations and send them to Moscow. But intelligence work isn't just about stealing information. It's about understanding the culture you're infiltrating. And Jack was beginning to understand America in ways that troubled him. Living as a deep cover agent means accepting that every relationship in your life is built on lies. But Jack Barsky wasn't just deceiving his American colleagues and neighbors. He was deceiving his own family. Back in East Germany, he had a wife named Gerlinda and a son named Matthias. They believed he was working for the government in some capacity, but they had no idea about the true nature of his assignment. Every 2 years, he would return to East Germany for debriefings, spending time with his family while reporting on his progress in America. These visits were carefully orchestrated. He would cross into East Germany through a predetermined route, meet with his handlers, and then spend time with his family before returning to his American life. To Gerlinda, these absences were simply part of his work. She never questioned why he couldn't discuss the details. But the psychological strain was becoming unbearable. Jack wasn't just maintaining one false identity. He was juggling 3 completely separate lives, each one requiring different emotional investments, different personalities, different loyalties. In America, he began developing relationships that felt genuine. He met a woman, fell in love, and eventually married her. They had a daughter named Chelsea, and for the first time since his training began, Jack experienced something that felt like authentic happiness. But this happiness was built on the deepest kind of deception. His American wife had no idea that her husband was already married, that he had another family in East Germany, or that his entire identity was a carefully constructed fiction. The emotional cost of this deception was something that Soviet intelligence had never fully prepared him for. How do you love someone while lying to them about everything? How do you raise a child while knowing that your entire relationship is built on secrets that could destroy everything? Jack found himself caught between three worlds, belonging fully to none of them. 1988 was supposed to be a routine year. Jack had been operating successfully for a decade, sending valuable intelligence to Moscow while maintaining his cover in America. But then something changed. The message came through the usual channels, encoded in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. It was an emergency extraction order. Jack was to abandon his American life immediately and return to the Soviet Union. The timing was suspicious. Political changes were happening in Moscow, and there were rumors that some deep cover operations were being compromised. Jack's handlers wanted him out of America before something went wrong. But leaving meant abandoning Chelsea, his daughter, who was still just a child. It meant walking away from the life he had built, the relationships that had become more real to him than anything else. The extraction plan was typically sophisticated. Jack was directed to a location on Staten Island, where Soviet intelligence had hidden emergency supplies, new identity documents, money, and everything he would need to disappear completely. But when he arrived at the designated location, the container was gone. Someone had discovered it, or the intelligence had been compromised. Jack was stranded, with no way to safely leave the country and no way to explain his situation to his handlers. For the first time in his career as a Soviet agent, Jack made a decision based on his own desires rather than his training. He chose to stay in America, to remain with his daughter, even though it meant defying direct orders from Moscow. To buy time, he crafted an elaborate deception. He sent a message to his Soviet handlers, claiming that he had been diagnosed with a serious illness, something that would explain his inability to travel. The diagnosis he chose was particularly cruel. He claimed to be suffering from the condition that was devastating communities across America in the 1980s. The deception worked. Soviet intelligence declared him dead and closed his file. But Jack wasn't dead. He was still in America, still living his double life, but now completely cut off from the organization that had created him. What Jack didn't know was that his name had already surfaced in a file that would change everything. In Moscow, a former intelligence officer named Vasily Mitrokhin had been quietly copying secret documents for years, preparing for his own defection to the West. When Mitrokhin finally escaped to Britain in the 1990s, he brought with him thousands of pages of Soviet intelligence files. Among those documents was a name that would capture the attention of American investigators: Jack Barsky. The FBI began an investigation that was unlike anything in their recent experience. They weren't looking for a terrorist or a criminal. They were hunting a ghost, someone who had been living among Americans for decades without anyone suspecting his true identity. The surveillance operation was a masterpiece of patience and planning. Agents bought the house next door to Jack's home, posing as ordinary neighbors while installing sophisticated listening devices that could monitor his every conversation. They watched him coach his daughter's softball team. They observed him at parent-teacher conferences. They documented his daily routines, his relationships, his apparent commitment to his American life. But they were also listening for something specific. Any indication that Jack was still in contact with his Soviet handlers. Any evidence that he was continuing to gather intelligence. What they discovered was both surprising and troubling. Jack wasn't acting like an active agent. he seemed to be living a genuinely normal life, completely disconnected from any intelligence activities. The breakthrough came during a domestic argument. Jack and his wife were having a heated discussion about their relationship, and in a moment of frustration, Jack made a statement that confirmed everything the FBI suspected. He referenced his past, his training, his work for Soviet intelligence. The surveillance equipment captured every word. The confrontation came on a quiet morning in 1997. Jack was preparing for another ordinary day when FBI agents appeared at his door. They were polite, professional, and completely prepared for whatever resistance he might offer. But Jack didn't resist. After decades of living with the weight of his deception, there was almost a sense of relief in finally being discovered. The interrogation that followed was unlike anything in FBI history. Instead of denying his identity or demanding a lawyer, Jack began to cooperate. He explained his training, his mission, his gradual disillusionment with Soviet intelligence. What emerged was a portrait of someone who had been transformed by his experience in America. The man who had arrived in 1978 as a committed Soviet agent had become something else entirely. He had developed genuine affection for American culture, genuine relationships with American people, and a genuine desire to protect the country he had once been sent to spy on. The FBI faced an unusual decision. They had captured a Soviet agent who had stolen American secrets for decades. But they also had someone who was offering to share everything he knew about Soviet intelligence operations. Jack's knowledge was extensive. He understood Soviet training methods, communication systems, and operational procedures. He knew how deep cover agents were recruited, trained, and deployed. Most importantly, he might be able to help identify other agents who were still operating in America. The decision to offer him cooperation instead of prosecution was controversial, but it was also practical. Jack could be more valuable as an asset than as a prisoner. Today, Jack Barsky lives quietly in upstate New York. He became an American citizen, ironically achieving through legal means what he had originally obtained through deception. He works as a security consultant, using his knowledge of intelligence operations to help protect American interests. But the cost of his transformation has been enormous. He spent years rebuilding his relationship with Chelsea, who learned the truth about her father's identity when she turned 18. The revelation was devastating, but she eventually chose to maintain their relationship. More surprisingly, Jack was also able to reconnect with his German son, Matthias, who had grown up believing his father was dead. The reunion was complicated by decades of separation and the strange circumstances of Jack's disappearance. Perhaps most remarkably, Jack maintains a friendship with the FBI agent who arrested him. They speak regularly, and Jack continues to provide insights into intelligence operations when requested. But questions remain. Was Jack truly reformed, or was his cooperation simply another form of deception? How many other deep cover agents remain undetected in America? And what does Jack's story tell us about the nature of identity, loyalty, and the possibility of redemption? Jack himself seems to understand the ambiguity of his situation. He has spoken about wanting to meet his maker clean, suggesting that he views his cooperation with American authorities as a form of penance for his years of deception. Yet the fundamental question remains unanswered. In a world where nothing is entirely what it seems, how do we measure the worth of a man who spent 30 years living a lie, only to spend his final years trying to tell the truth? The spy who never went to jail may have found something more valuable than freedom. He may have found a way to transform betrayal into redemption, deception into truth, and a life built on lies into something resembling authentic existence. But only time will tell whether that transformation is real or simply the most sophisticated deception of all.